The alarm did not sound like any alarm I had heard before. I was 3 hours into my posting on Meridian Anchor when the walls began to hum a low red pulse, and every human in the corridor stopped talking at once. Not screaming, not running, stopping. That silence scared me more than the sound did. My name is Kalis Thornvey. I come from the Concord of Rin, a people who speak through light instead of sound, who touch only in ritual, who plan every action 3 steps ahead before we take the first one. I had been sent to Meridian Anchor to observe the newest species in the galaxy, a species called humans, and to write a report on whether they were ready to sit at the great table with the rest of us. I did not know, in that first hour, that the report would end up being about something else entirely. A woman beside me set down her drink without spilling a drop and turned toward the sound like a compass needle finding north. Her name tag read Bennett. She did not look afraid. She looked like she had been waiting for this her whole life, and was almost relieved it had finally come. I asked her what the alarm meant. She said, "That's a hull breach 2 decks down." Then she walked toward it. Not away from it. Toward it. I want you to understand something about every other species you will ever meet in the stars. When danger comes, we move away from it and let the trained few move toward it. That is how the Krish do it. That is how my own people do it. There are protocols. There are committees. There are 17 forms to fill out before a weapon may be drawn on a shared station, because shared stations belong to everyone, and everyone must agree before force is used. Bennett did not fill out a form. Bennett grabbed a fire suppression rod off the wall, checked it once with her thumb, and broke into a run. I followed her because I did not know what else to do, and because some small traitorous part of my mind wanted to see what a human looked like when the danger was real instead of theoretical. We reached the breach in under 2 minutes. A supply drone had drifted off its rail and punched a hole through an unpressurized cargo bay, and on the other side of that hole, in the vacuum, 3 dock workers were clinging to a support strut with their emergency tethers tangled around each other. The atmosphere was bleeding out through the gap in long silver ribbons that caught the light and made the whole scene look almost beautiful, if you forgot that beautiful things can kill you just as easily as ugly ones. Bennett did not wait for a rescue team. She did not check a manual. She wedged the fire rod into the hull breach at an angle I would later learn was exactly right to slow the leak, and she shouted 3 names into her comm unit before the door had even finished cycling shut behind her. I stood in the hallway and watched through the reinforced glass as a human woman I had known for 11 minutes put her own body between a hole in the universe and 3 strangers she had never met. The rescue took 4 minutes. It felt like 4 hours. When it was over, Bennett walked back through the airlock with a cut across her forearm that she had not noticed yet, and she asked me if I wanted coffee. I said yes because I did not know what else to say. That is how my first day on Meridian Anchor ended. Not with paperwork, not with a briefing. With a woman named Laura Bennett bleeding quietly into a napkin while she explained to me, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, that on a human station, whoever is closest to the danger is the one who deals with it, because waiting for permission costs lives, and humans have decided, a very long time ago, that they would rather be wrong and fast than right and late. I did not sleep well that night. Every sound in the station made me flinch. I kept hearing that alarm, that particular pitch built to cut through panic and denial in half a second, built by a species that has apparently needed that skill more times than I wanted to imagine. The next morning I requested a formal meeting with the station's human liaison office to discuss protocol. I was told, politely, that there was no protocol. There was only the duty roster, and whoever was on it did what needed doing. I asked what happens if the wrong person is on duty, if someone panics, if someone freezes. The officer who answered me, a quiet man named Daniel Cross, looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. He said humans used to ask that question a lot too, a long time ago. Then they stopped asking it. Not because the answer got better, because they realized the question itself was a luxury. On old Earth, he said, there was no version of the story where someone else came to save you in time. You were the someone else. Every single time. For every single person you loved. I asked him if that frightened him. He said no. He said it used to frighten his ancestors so much that they built an entire species around never being caught without an answer again. I wrote that sentence down in my personal log, word for word, because I did not understand it yet, and I had a strange, cold feeling that I was going to need it later. 3 days passed in a quieter rhythm. I toured the station, met traders from 6 systems, filed reports on shipping routes, and diplomatic protocol that no one back home would ever read closely. I began to relax. I began to think that the breach, and Bennett's calm violence toward the vacuum trying to kill 3 strangers, had been an unusual event, an outlier, not a window into anything larger. I was wrong about that, the way I would be wrong about almost everything I believed about humans in my first week among them. On the 4th day, a trade envoy from the Krish cluster asked to tour the human residential wing out of simple curiosity, the same way I might wander through a market stall I had no intention of buying from. He was turned away at the single unlocked door by a young woman half his size, who smiled the entire time she told him no, and somehow made the smile more unsettling than a raised weapon would have been. I asked her later why the door had no lock if she was only going to stand in front of it anyway. She said the lock was never the point. She was the point. A lock stops people who are willing to be stopped. She said humans learned a long time ago that anything determined enough to get through a door will get through a door. So instead of wasting time and metal on locks, they put something behind the door that actually mattered. I asked her what that something was. She said, us. That single word sat with me for the rest of the day, turning over and over, refusing to settle into any shape I recognized. Every other species builds walls to keep danger out. Humans, it seemed, built themselves into the wall, and dared the danger to try anyway. That night I filed my first honest report back to the Concord. I wrote that the humans of Meridian Anchor did not behave like a young species finding its footing among older, wiser neighbors. I wrote that they behaved like a species that had already survived something far worse than anything the rest of us had prepared for, and had simply never stopped preparing since. I did not know yet how right that sentence was. I did not know that within the week, I would watch that same preparation turn outward, against something that had drifted into our shared space with no warning and no mercy, and that when it did, every other delegation on that station would freeze exactly the way committees freeze, exactly the way locks fail, exactly the way careful, patient, reasonable species always freeze, when the moment finally demands something other than patience. And I would watch the humans move, not toward safety, toward the danger, the same way Laura Bennett had moved toward a hole in the universe on my very first day, because some quiet and terrible history had taught her species, long before I was ever born, that the ones who wait for someone else to go first are usually the ones who do not get a second chance to learn the lesson. The ship came out of nowhere, which is a phrase I used to think was an exaggeration until I watched it happen with my own eyes. One moment the long-range sensors showed clean space beyond the station's outer ring. The next moment, there was a shape where no shape should have been, tumbling slowly, trailing a thin dark smoke that should not have existed in vacuum unless something inside it was still burning. Every alarm on Meridian Anchor lit at once, and this time, the sound was different from the breach alarm I had heard on my first day. This one was lower, older, built, I would learn later, for exactly one purpose: to tell every soul on the station that something had arrived that nobody had invited. I was in the observation lounge with a Krish trade envoy named Vras when it happened. Vras immediately began composing a formal request to the station council for an emergency session to determine jurisdiction. I remember thinking that was the correct response. That was the response my own people would have given. Gather the wise, weigh the risk, vote. Across the lounge, a human engineer named Grace Whitfield set down her tablet, looked at the shape on the screen for exactly 2 seconds, and said one word into her comm. Weapons. Not a question, not a request, a word, thrown into the air like a stone, already moving before it landed. I asked her how she could possibly know what the ship was before it had even been scanned. She said she didn't know. She said that was exactly why she said it. Because if she was wrong, the cost was an apology. If she waited to be sure and she was right, the cost was everyone on this side of the ring. I did not have an answer for that kind of math. I am not sure any of my people ever have. The unidentified vessel drifted closer, and the station's automated defense grid, the one every species had paid into equally, the one that was supposed to represent all of us acting together, did nothing. It simply sat there, waiting for the council to reach quorum, waiting for someone with the correct authorization codes to press the correct button in the correct order. I watched 3 human ships break formation from the docking ring without that authorization. They were small, ugly, almost, compared to the sleek diplomatic cruisers my own people favor. Built for endurance, not elegance, the way a good pair of boots is built for a long road rather than a photograph. I later learned their names: the Wren, the Half Moon, the Steady Rain, which I thought was a strange name for a warship until someone explained that humans sometimes name their weapons after the quiet things that outlast the loud ones. Vrass turned to me, furious, and asked by what right 3 unauthorized human vessels were moving to intercept an unidentified contact without council approval. I did not have an answer for him either. I only had a memory of a young woman standing in front of an unlocked door, telling me that the lock was never the point. The drone, because that is what it turned out to be, was old. Ancient even, a leftover weapon from an empire that had burned itself out of the history books before my species had even developed long-range travel. It had no pilot, no mind behind its eyes, if it could be said to have eyes at all. Only a set of instructions, written by someone long dead, that told it to treat any station bearing the old empire's rival markings as a target. Meridian Anchor bore those markings, faintly, layered under 6 generations of paint and renovation, invisible to every scanner in the galaxy except, it turned out, the drones. And except one human sensor operator who happened to still run a passive historical scan that nobody else bothered maintaining, because nobody else considered a dead empire's leftover grudges worth the processing power. Her name was Ellen Marsh, and I met her for the first time that day, standing over a console with her jaw set in a line I would come to recognize as the particular stillness humans wear right before they do something that terrifies everyone around them. She had flagged the drone 11 minutes before it fully decloaked, 11 minutes that no council vote could have used, because no council vote moves that fast, because councils are built by species who assume they will always have time, and humans, it seemed, had stopped assuming that a very long time ago. The council was still in session, still debating jurisdiction, when the Steady Rain put itself between the drone and the residential ring. I asked Cross, who had come to stand beside me in the observation lounge with a stillness that matched Marsh's exactly, why the ship's crew would risk themselves for a station that was not even fully theirs. Half the delegations aboard, myself included, had spent the last 3 days treating humans as guests, still earning their place at the table. He said the ship's crew was not thinking about whose station it was. He said they were thinking about how many people were standing between that drone and open space, and that the number was the only variable that mattered to them in that moment. I asked him if that was fear talking or something else. He said fear would have kept them docked. What moved them was older than fear. He called it a debt. He said humans have spent so much of their history owing something to the people who came before them, people who starved and froze and bled, so that later generations could simply exist, that the instinct to pay that debt forward, to whoever happens to be standing nearby when the moment comes, is not really a choice anymore. It is closer to breathing. I did not fully believe him, not yet. Then I watched the Steady Rain take a glancing hit meant for the outer residential ring, watched its hull flare and buckle along one flank, watched it hold position anyway instead of falling back to save itself, and I understood that Cross had not been speaking in metaphor. The drone was old, but it was not weak. It carried weapons designed to crack a planet's crust from orbit, scaled down for station combat, but still, according to every technical readout I later reviewed, capable of turning Meridian Anchor's residential ring into debris within a single firing cycle if it had been allowed a clear shot. It never got that clear shot. The Wren and the Half Moon closed the gap on either flank while the Steady Rain held the center, and for 6 minutes, which felt to me like the longest 6 minutes of my life up to that point, 3 small human ships did the work that an entire multi-species defense council could not authorize in time to matter. I watched Marsh the entire time. She did not look away from her screen once. Her hands moved across the console with a steadiness that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with practice. The kind of practice that only comes from a species that has trained its children, generation after generation, to function correctly, even when their hands are shaking on the inside. When the drone finally went dark, gutted by a coordinated strike that Marsh had calculated and relayed in under 4 seconds, the observation lounge erupted into noise. Delegates from 6 systems began talking over each other, some in relief, some already composing formal complaints about unauthorized military action on a shared station. The humans in the room did not celebrate. They did a head count. I watched Whitfield move quietly from group to group, confirming names, confirming faces, confirming that everyone who had been on that ring 5 minutes ago was still on it now. Only after the last name was confirmed did something in her shoulders loosen, and even then, it was not relief exactly. It was closer to the particular exhaustion of a task correctly finished. Nothing more, nothing less. I asked her afterward why the celebration in the room had felt so wrong to her. She said there would be time to feel something later, once she was certain there was nothing left to do. She said humans learned a long time ago that the moment you start celebrating is the exact moment you stop watching, and the thing you stop watching for is usually the thing that gets you. That night I sat alone in my quarters and replayed the 6 minutes over and over in my memory, trying to find the place where the humans had hesitated, had waited for permission, had asked whether it was truly their responsibility to risk 3 ships, and however many lives, for a station that technically belonged to everyone, and no one at once. I could not find that moment. It did not exist. There had been a threat, and then there had been 3 ships moving to meet it, and the space between those 2 facts was so narrow I could not fit a single word of debate into it. The council finished its emergency session 4 hours after the drone had already been destroyed. Their final resolution, printed and circulated the next morning, formally condemned the unauthorized deployment of human vessels, while simultaneously, almost in the same paragraph, thanking those same vessels for saving an estimated 1,100 lives. I read that resolution twice, and both times I found myself thinking of the unlocked door in the human residential wing, and the young woman standing in front of it, and her single quiet answer to my question about what was actually keeping that hallway safe. Us. It was starting to sound less like an answer and more like a warning, the kind other species were apparently supposed to have already understood, the kind written into the very shape of how humans moved through the galaxy, fast and unasked, and unafraid of being wrong in the direction of saving someone. I requested access to the ship's after-action logs, expecting military jargon, expecting cold tactical language stripped of anything human at all. What I found instead, buried in Ellen Marsh's own voice log recorded in the minutes after the drone went dark, was a single line that I copied into my personal archive and have never been able to delete since. She said, "We didn't have time to be scared, so we'll be scared later, together, when it's safe enough to afford it." I did not understand, that night, just how much later that would turn out to be, or how much more there was still left for me to learn about a species that had apparently decided, somewhere far back in its bloody, unforgiving history, that fear was a bill best paid, after the danger had already passed, never before. 3 days after the drone attack, I asked for permission to study human history in full, not the polished summaries handed to visiting diplomats, but the raw archive, the parts nobody edits for outsiders. The request should have taken weeks to process. It took 4 hours. A young archivist named Peter Hale met me at the station library, a converted cargo bay lined with terminals instead of shelves, and handed me a data key, without asking a single question about why I wanted it. I asked him if he was not curious what a foreign diplomat wanted with his species' darkest records. He said everyone eventually asks for this. He said it was better to just hand it over and let people find their own way through it, because no explanation he could give would prepare me for what I was about to read anyway. He was right. I began, foolishly, with what I assumed would be the safest entry point. Early spaceflight. Rockets and math and the first tentative steps off a single small planet. I expected pride. I expected triumph. What I found instead was a species that had reached for the stars, while its own world was still actively trying to kill it, in every possible way. Disease that erased entire cities before anyone understood what disease even was. Famine that could take a harvest and, with it, 1,000,000 lives, in a single bad season. War that repeated itself generation after generation, like a wound that never fully closed, only scarred over thin enough to split open again. I read about children who did not live past their 5th year, so many of them that entire cultures built rituals around delaying the naming of a newborn, waiting to see if the child would survive long enough to be worth the grief of losing. I read about winters where entire villages ate the leather from their own boots to survive one more week. I read, and this is the entry that finally made me set the data key down and simply sit in silence for a long while. About a single century in which humanity endured 2 wars so large they reshaped the meaning of the word war itself. Wars that killed tens of millions. Wars fought with weapons crude enough that a soldier could watch, up close, exactly what those weapons did to a body, and then be expected to do it again the next morning. I asked Hale, when I finally returned to the terminal desk, how a species survives that. Not survives it once, survives it as a pattern, over and over, century after century, and still chooses, afterward, to build ships and reach outward into a universe that had given them absolutely no reason to trust it. He said his people did not survive it by being stronger than everyone else. He said they survived it by refusing to accept that surviving was optional. I did not understand the distinction at first. He explained it slowly, the way you explain something you have had to explain many times before, to many people, none of whom ever quite grasped it on the first telling either. He said other species, when faced with overwhelming danger, calculate the odds and sometimes choose to accept a loss, to preserve resources, to wait for a better position. He said humans, somewhere very far back, stopped being willing to make that calculation, not because they were braver, because they had learned, at a cost too large to properly describe, that accepting a loss when a loss could still be fought was the beginning of accepting every loss after it. He told me about a moment in that same brutal century, a single night when a city was being bombed, and the people sheltering underground kept singing, not because they were unafraid, but because singing was something they could still choose to do, while everything else was being taken from them. He said that story gets told to human children not as a tragedy, but as an instruction. You do not get to choose what happens to you. You only ever get to choose what you do while it is happening. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest about something here, because the checklist I hold myself to as an observer demands honesty even when it is uncomfortable. Part of me, reading those records, expected to find justification for the readiness I had already witnessed on this station. The unlocked door, the fire rod grabbed without hesitation, the 3 ships moving before the council could even finish taking attendance. I expected the history to explain the readiness the way a scar explains a wound. It did explain it, but it explained something else too, something I had not expected to find at all. I found humor. Not despite the horror, beside it, woven through it in a way that unsettled me more than the horror alone ever could have. I found records of soldiers, freezing in trenches with the sound of shelling never fully stopping, who wrote letters home about the terrible quality of the coffee. I found records of survivors of famine who, decades later, told stories about that time with a strange, sideways laughter, the kind that does not mean the pain is gone, only that the pain has learned to share space with something else. I asked Hale about this, about the whistling I had heard from Alves in the corridor days earlier, cheerful and untroubled, standing not 20 feet from a terminal displaying centuries of catastrophe. He said humans do not carry their history by remembering it constantly. He said they carry it by never fully forgetting it is possible, and then choosing, every single day, to build something anyway. He said the whistling and the horror are not contradictions. He said they are the same coin, and a species only survives long enough to build starships if it learns to hold both sides at once without dropping either one. I asked him if that was exhausting. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened into something almost gentle. He said it used to be. He said his grandmother told him once that her own grandmother carried grief the way you carry a stone in your pocket, always there, never spoken of, worn smooth by decades of quiet handling, until it stopped cutting, and simply became part of the weight you were used to. I asked him what changed. He said nothing changed. He said that is simply what surviving looks like, up close, when you are the one doing it, instead of reading about it from a safe distance. I left the archive that evening carrying something heavier than the data key I returned to Hale at the desk. I walked the length of the human residential ring slowly, looking at it differently than I had looked at it before. The unlocked door was still unlocked. The corridor lights were still warm, deliberately warm, I now understood, chosen that way by people who had spent enough of their history in cold, gray places That warmth had become a kind of quiet defiance all its own. I passed Bennett, off duty, sitting with two others I did not recognize, laughing at something on a small handheld screen. Her forearm still carried the faint mark of the cut she had gotten on my first day. Healed now, barely visible unless you already knew where to look. She waved me over without hesitation, the way humans do, as if inclusion were the default state of things rather than something that needed to be earned or negotiated first. I sat. I did not fully participate in the conversation, still turning over everything I had read, but I let the warmth of the room settle around me anyway, and for a little while I understood, in a way that had nothing to do with logic, why this species needed both the horror and the whistling in equal measure. One without the other would have broken them a long time ago. The horror alone would have crushed them into stillness. The whistling alone would have left them unprepared for a universe that has never once promised to be kind. Together, somehow, the two currents kept them moving. Later that night, alone in my quarters, I opened my personal log and began writing the section of my report I knew would be the hardest for my own people to accept. I wrote that humanity's readiness was not a policy. It was not trained into soldiers through simulation and doctrine alone, though there was plenty of that too. It was inherited, cell-deep, passed down through generations who had no choice but to learn it the hard way, and who had decided, somewhere along that long, hard road, that the lesson was worth keeping, even after the immediate danger that taught it had finally passed. I wrote that other species build defenses to keep catastrophe out. Humans built themselves to survive catastrophe getting in anyway, because their own history had taught them, over and over, in ways no council resolution could ever undo, that the door does not always hold. That sometimes the wall does not hold either. That in the end, the only thing that reliably holds is the person standing behind it, refusing, for reasons buried so deep in their history that even they can no longer fully name it, to let the story end there. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in the dark listening to the quiet hum of the station around me, and for the first time since arriving on Meridian Anchor, the sound did not frighten me. It reminded me of singing in a shelter, sung by people who could not stop the bombs but refused to let the bombs be the only sound left in the room. I understood, finally, why the unlocked door was never really about the lock at all. It was about who was standing behind it, and what that standing had cost them, generation after generation, long before I or anyone from my Concord had ever thought to ask. I did not expect to become part of the story I had been sent to observe. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, if any afternoon on Meridian Anchor could still be called ordinary, after everything I had already witnessed. I was walking back from the trade quarter with a bag of dried fruit Bennett had insisted I try, arguing quietly with myself about whether the taste was pleasant or simply strange, when the lights along the corridor flickered once, then held steady in a pattern I had not seen before. Not red, not the alarm color, amber, slow and deliberate, pulsing like something patient. A man I did not recognize stepped out of a side corridor and took hold of my arm. He was not human. I want to be clear about that, because for one confused moment, I assumed the danger, whatever it was, must be coming from outside the station, the way it always had before. He was Krish, like Vras, but his eyes carried none of Vras's careful diplomatic patience. He said something quick and low in a dialect I only partly understood, something about a debt owed, and a Concord representative being worth more alive as leverage than as an ally. I understood enough of it to know that I was the leverage. I will not pretend I was calm. My people do not train for physical confrontation the way humans apparently do. We train for negotiation, for patience, for the slow art of making an opponent agree with you before they realize they have been persuaded at all. None of that training prepared me for a hand closing around my arm hard enough to bruise, or for the sudden, total absence of any clever words that might talk my way free of it. He pulled me toward the amber-lit corridor, away from the main concourse, and for 3 full seconds I believed, with a clarity that frightened me more than the danger itself, that no one was coming. Then I heard footsteps that were not running. They were walking, fast and level, the particular gait of someone who has already decided exactly what they are about to do, and sees no reason to waste energy sprinting toward it. It was Cross. He did not shout a warning. He did not ask the man to let me go. He simply closed the distance between us with a speed that did not match his unhurried steps, and the next thing I understood clearly was that I was no longer being held, and the man who had been holding me was on the floor, and Cross was crouched over him with one knee planted between his shoulder blades, speaking into his comm unit in a voice so calm it was almost conversational, as if he were reporting a minor equipment malfunction rather than a kidnapping in progress. I stood frozen against the corridor wall, my bag of dried fruit somehow still clutched in one hand, and I stared at Cross the way you stare at something you thought you understood, and suddenly realize you have only ever seen from the outside. He looked up at me once he had secured the man, and his expression shifted, just slightly, into something gentler. He asked if I was hurt. I said no. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. He asked if I wanted to sit down. I said no again, though my legs disagreed with me on that point rather strongly. Security arrived within the minute, and the man who had grabbed me was taken away, still talking about debts and leverage, and a Concord bounty I did not fully understand, and did not, in that moment, particularly want to. Cross stayed with me the entire time, not hovering, not fussing, simply present, the way a wall is present, solid and unbothered, exactly where you need it to be, without ever making you feel small for needing it. It was Bennett who found us a few minutes later, having heard the Amber Alert from wherever she had been, and the first thing she did, before asking a single question about what had happened, was take the crushed bag of dried fruit gently out of my hand and replace it with a fresh one from her own pocket, as if that small correction mattered more than anything else in that moment. I laughed. I did not expect to. It came out of me sideways, cracked and strange, and once it started I could not immediately stop it, and underneath the laughing, something else was moving too, something that had been sitting very still and very cold in my chest since the moment that hand first closed around my arm. Bennett did not tell me to stop laughing. She did not tell me it was all right, or that I was safe now, or any of the careful reassurances my own people would have offered in that situation. She simply sat down next to me on the floor of the corridor, dried fruit forgotten between us, and waited, the way you wait out weather, patient and unhurried, until whatever was moving through me had finished moving. When it had, she asked me one question. She asked if I wanted to know why he came so fast. I nodded. She said Cross did not run because he heard an alarm. He ran because he heard my voice cut off mid-word over the corridor's ambient audio pickup, 3 full seconds before the Amber Alert even triggered. She said humans on this station are trained, all of them, delegate liaisons included, to notice when a conversation stops wrong. Not politely, not naturally. Wrong. And she said that when it stops wrong, nobody waits for confirmation, because confirmation is a luxury bought with someone else's suffering while you wait for it to arrive. I asked her, my voice steadier now, why a human would risk himself that fast, for someone who was not even his own species. I was not human. I was not his ally by any treaty, not his responsibility by any formal agreement between our peoples. She looked at me like the question itself did not quite make sense to her, the way I imagine I must have looked to Cross earlier when I asked why the door had no lock. She said the treaty was never the point. She said humans decided a long time ago, somewhere back in that brutal history I had spent 3 days reading in the archive, that the line between who mattered and who did not mattered less than they used to think it did. She said it had cost them everything to learn that lesson, and once a species pays a price that steep for an idea, they do not set the idea down again just because the person standing in front of them happens to look different from them. That evening, station security completed a full review of the Amber Alert, and I was asked, gently, whether I wanted to file a formal complaint against the Concord bounty network that had apparently marked me, quietly and without my knowledge, as valuable enough to be worth kidnapping. I said yes. I filed it with hands that were only slightly unsteady. What I did not expect was the second part of that review, delivered to me almost as an afterthought by the station's chief liaison officer, a tired, precise woman named Sophie Lang, who I had barely spoken to before that day. She told me that the incident had triggered an automatic review of station protocol because it was the 3rd unauthorized human intervention in as many weeks, and the Multi-Species Council was, once again, drafting formal language about jurisdiction and authorization and the proper chain of command for responding to threats aboard a shared station. I asked her, tired myself now in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, what the council intended to do about it. She said the council intended to require prior authorization for any armed response by any delegation, human or otherwise, going forward. She said it as if reading a weather report, flat and unbothered, the way you describe something you already know will not survive contact with reality. I asked her if the humans intended to comply. She looked at me for a long moment, and something almost like sympathy crossed her face, the particular sympathy of someone explaining a fact of gravity to a person who has only ever lived somewhere with no ground beneath their feet. She said humans would sign whatever paperwork the council required. She said they would nod politely in every session. She said the language would be filed and archived and referenced in every future diplomatic briefing about the human delegation's cooperative status. Then she said quietly that the next time an alarm sounded on this station, human feet would move before that paperwork ever crossed anyone's mind, exactly the same as they always had, because paperwork does not bleed, and the people it is meant to protect sometimes do. I understood, sitting there in her office with the bruise on my arm just beginning to darken, that I had finally arrived at the true center of my report. Not the unlocked door, not the ships that moved before the council voted, not even the archive full of famine and fire and quiet, stubborn singing in the dark. The true center was this. Every rule, every treaty, every carefully worded resolution, meant to bind humanity's readiness into something predictable and controllable, would, in the end, mean nothing at all the moment a life was actually on the line, because humans had decided, long before any of us arrived to negotiate with them, that some debts are owed to the moment itself, not to the paperwork that comes after it. I went to find Cross before I returned to my quarters that night. I found him in the mess hall, alone, eating something plain and unremarkable, looking entirely unbothered by what had happened only hours earlier, as if putting a man twice his size on the floor of a corridor was simply one more task completed on an otherwise unremarkable day. I sat across from him and asked, finally, the question I had been carrying since the archive. I asked him how he lives with it, the readiness, the constant, quiet expectation that at any moment the floor might open and someone might need him to move before he has time to think. He set down his fork and considered the question with more care than I expected. He said he does not think of it as a burden. He said he thinks of it the way you think of breathing, something your body simply does, correctly, without needing your permission first. He said the day it starts to feel like a burden is the day something has gone wrong, and on Meridian Anchor, so far, nothing had. I asked him if he was ever afraid. He said yes. Every time. He said the fear does not go away with practice. It just stops being allowed to decide anything. I did not have a response to that. I simply sat with him in silence for a while, two very different kinds of beings, sharing a table in a mess hall, on a station built by no one and everyone at once, and for the first time since my arrival, the silence between us did not feel like the careful, measured silence of diplomacy. It felt like something closer to trust, quiet and unearned, and given anyway. The way I now understood humans seemed to give it to almost anyone standing close enough to need it. The council session that finally decided the matter took place 2 weeks after the Amber Alert, and I was permitted to attend as an observing witness, since my own attempted kidnapping had become, without my asking for it, one of the central pieces of evidence in the debate. The chamber was full that day, every delegation present, every species represented by someone in their finest formal dress, because everyone understood, even before the session opened, that whatever was decided here would set a precedent for every shared station built after this one. Vrass spoke first, and to his credit, his argument was not unreasonable. He said unauthorized armed response by any single delegation, however well-intentioned, undermined the entire principle of shared governance that stations like Meridian Anchor were built on. He said if humans could act without permission today, some other species might claim the same right tomorrow, and not every species that claimed it would be acting with humanity's apparent restraint. I watched several delegates nod at that. It was a fair point. It was the kind of point my own people are trained from childhood to construct and defend, careful and logical, and built to survive scrutiny from every angle. Lang spoke for the human delegation, and she did not argue against Vrass's logic at all. She agreed with almost every word of it. She said humans understood the danger of unchecked unilateral action, as well as anyone in that chamber. Perhaps better, given how much of their own history had been shaped by exactly that kind of danger, turned in the wrong direction. Then she said something that changed the entire shape of the room. She said the council was welcome to draft any resolution it wished. She said humanity would sign it, honor its language in every formal setting, and reference it in every diplomatic briefing going forward, exactly as it had signed every other resolution asked of it since joining the wider community of species. She said the resolution would also, functionally, change nothing at all. A murmur moved through the chamber at that, somewhere between offense and confusion. Vrass asked, with careful diplomatic restraint that did not fully hide his irritation, what exactly she meant by that. Lang said humans do not experience the choice to act in a crisis as a choice at all. She said asking them to wait for authorization before responding to an immediate threat was, from the human perspective, roughly equivalent to asking someone not to flinch when a hand moves suddenly toward their face. The instruction can be given. It can even be sincerely agreed to in a calm room, on a calm day, with no danger anywhere nearby. It simply will not survive the actual moment it was written for. She said this was not defiance. She said it was closer to a limitation, an honest one, the kind any species owes its neighbors before entering into an agreement it cannot actually keep. The chamber sat with that for a long moment, and I found myself, unexpectedly, thinking of the archive again, of children who did not live to be named, of soldiers writing home about bad coffee between one battle and the next, of a species that had spent so long living without the luxury of waiting, that the luxury itself had, somewhere along the way, stopped being something they were capable of trusting. It was Cross who spoke next, invited forward by Lang, to address a question one of the older delegates had raised about human military discipline, whether readiness of this kind could ever truly be reconciled with restraint. He said something I have carried with me every day since, word for word, and I offer it here exactly as I recorded it, because I do not believe I could improve on it by changing a single syllable. He said humans are not choosing between restraint and readiness. He said they had simply learned, at a cost most other species in that room could not fully imagine, that restraint is what happens after the danger has passed, never during it. He said every human standing on Meridian Anchor would gladly debate policy, attend every session, sign every treaty, and argue every fine point of jurisdiction for as long as the room required, right up until the exact moment someone's life depended on the argument ending instead. He said at that moment, and only at that moment, the debate simply stopped mattering to them, not out of arrogance, but out of a kind of grief, so old it had become instinct, the grief of every ancestor who had ever waited one moment too long for permission that never came in time. The chamber was silent after that, in a way I had not heard it be silent before. The resolution that emerged from that session, after several more hours of debate that I will not recount here, because very little of it changed the outcome that had already become obvious to everyone in the room, contained a single clause that would go on to define every shared station built afterward across the length of known space. It stated that in matters of immediate, undefined threat to life aboard any joint facility, authorization requirements would be formally waived for human personnel and vessels, on the understanding, stated plainly in the resolution's own language, that such authorization would in practice never arrive in time regardless of what the Council decided. Every other delegation retained the standard authorization requirement. Only humans were named as exempt. I have read that clause perhaps 100 times since it was ratified, and I still find something quietly devastating in the plainness of its wording. It does not celebrate humanity. It does not praise their courage or their sacrifice. It simply states, in flat legal language, a fact that every species aboard that station had already watched prove itself true, over and over, in the weeks leading up to the vote. Only humans may enter without permission, because humans had already demonstrated, at real cost to themselves, that permission was never truly the thing standing between them and the moment they were needed. I remained on Meridian Anchor for another month after the resolution passed, finishing the report I had originally been sent to write. It was not the report I expected to submit when I first arrived. I had come to observe a young species and determine whether it was ready for the wider galaxy. I left having learned that the question itself had been built backward from the start. Humanity was not waiting to be judged ready by the rest of us. Humanity had already decided, long before any ship of ours ever reached theirs, exactly what kind of neighbors it intended to be, and it had paid for that decision in installments no other species in that chamber could have survived paying. On my last evening aboard the station, Bennett found me in the observation lounge, looking out at the stars, the way I had looked out at them on my very first night, though I understood them differently now than I had then. She sat beside me without asking, the way humans always seem to, as if the space next to them simply belongs to whoever needs it in the moment. She asked if I was ready to go home. I said I was not entirely sure what home would look like now, after everything I had seen. She laughed, quiet and easy, and said that was probably a good sign. She said the people who come through Meridian Anchor unchanged are usually the ones who were not paying attention. We sat together for a while without speaking, and I found myself thinking of that unlocked door in the human residential wing, the one I had first noticed on my earliest day aboard the station, back when I still believed it was simply a careless oversight. I understood now that it had never been carelessness. It had never even really been about the door at all. The door was unlocked because the people behind it did not need one, because somewhere in their long, brutal, unlikely history, humans had decided that the strongest lock any door could ever have was not built from metal or code, but from the simple, unbearable certainty that whoever stood on the other side of it would move, without hesitation and without asking anyone's leave, the very instant it was needed. I did not say any of this to Bennett. I did not need to. She already knew it about her own people the way you know the shape of your own hand, too familiar to require explanation, too deep to ever fully put into words. Instead, I asked her, half joking, half genuinely curious, whether she would teach me that card game with the terrible odds one more time before I left. She grinned, already reaching for the worn deck she kept in her jacket pocket, and said of course, though she warned me I was probably going to lose again. I probably did. I do not fully remember. What I remember instead is the sound of her laughter filling the quiet lounge, warm and unhurried, the same warmth I had felt in every corridor of that residential ring since my first confused night aboard the station. I remember thinking, as the cards fell in patterns I did not understand and did not need to, that this was the truest answer to the question my report had been asked to settle. Not the ships, not the archive, not even the resolution itself, though all of it mattered, and none of it could be separated from the rest. The truest answer was simply this: a species capable of that much readiness, that much willingness to bleed for strangers without asking first, and still capable, in the very same breath, of sitting on a worn couch teaching a nervous alien diplomat how to lose gracefully at cards, was not a danger to the galaxy at all. It was the reason the galaxy, whether it fully understood this yet or not, had just become a great deal safer than it had ever been before. I filed my report the next morning, before my transport departed. I titled it simply, using the same words the Council had used in its final resolution, because I could not find any language of my own that captured the truth of it more precisely than theirs already had. Why only humans may enter without permission? Not because they demand the right, because they have already earned it. One unlocked door, one unauthorized ship, one bruised arm, and one quiet, unhurried afternoon of cards at a time. And because somewhere deep in a history none of the rest of us will ever fully carry, they decided, long before any of us arrived, to ask them to explain themselves. That permission was a debt owed to the people who come after, never a condition placed on the people who need saving right now.